As you saw, we touched on a bunch of different topics, and that was intended. That's good. So from travel to human-animal interaction to marginalization to modelization to redigesting some past topics to poetry, right? So if all the various panelists could take a seat and face the audience to an extent, we can start with a few questions and answers in case there are some, and I hope there are some, and I hope they're difficult. You had a question at the back of the room? Anybody? Selling fast? Nobody. Everything was clear and agreeable with? Okay.
First of all, thanks for all the talks, and those games look really interesting. This is a question for the Wheels of Aurelia game. I'm really interested in the dialogue system because it has a lot of potential for building relationships with characters in game. I was wondering if, based on your experience making it for this, how feasible would it be to make a similar dialogue system for a bigger, say, a AAA game, which is, say, 8 hours play length?
So how easily this kind of dialogue system scales to a bigger game?
Yeah.
But very, very easily. I think people are developing all new kinds of dialogue systems that are dynamic and that are modern. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of focus on narrative games yet, but it's changing and people are getting more. For example, Naughty Dog is like one of the examples. They're like trying to bring really dynamic dialogues in their games. And the way our system works is kind of similar to the way it works in The Last of Us. The way our system works is that each line has a topic that is set by that line and prerequisites and anti-requisites that check if any of the topics that are in these two groups were previously discussed in the conversation, and the dialogue system pulls all the lines that are available, consider the topics that were discussed before. So as you see, there is nothing that is particularly tied to linear progression or even a strict number of characters. You could have as many characters as you want, as a complex scene as you want. It's all a matter of like having a game system that triggers topics, and so enables lines of dialogue in a dialogue database, and then having the game pull out of randomly from these dialogues and building the connection between the lines. So it's totally doable at any scale.
Okay, and sorry, just to follow on, did you have any problems with?
I'm the host here. The point is that it is an interesting question, but he can ask you that in particular, and it's a development question. Whereas, I'm taking more happily philosophical questions, right? Then you can contact Pietro. We're going to be around. So.
Sure.
Great. Other kind of question? Okay, Sabine.
I hope it's philosophical enough. I was going to ask a question about values because I think that is one connecting point between all of your presentations, and like the struggle with values and the implied values that you actually did not talk about. For example, in this traveling kind of wandering simulator, how important is this aesthetic, like this dimension of like what kind of was the choice for putting this visual style in this game, and what were your assumptions? And then to the others, like for example with Martin, you were talking about modeling society, and you clearly highlighted how difficult and even impossible and like reductionist it must be to model something like a refugee situation. And how is your kind of political stance towards like in your mind and in your imagination, what like there are clear preferences of what values would flow into this kind of design, for instance. But feel free for everyone to like answer to.
Maybe one thing that I can quickly say to that is I was for example, we just had a short discussion about the patriots, because I would have called them nationalists, but that was a decision that the original designer of the game made for me. So they were already there. I couldn't add nationalists to the patriots because that would have made everything even more complicated. So while I was designing the game, I was at first especially confronted with the design decisions that were already taken, and they were sometimes just in labels and in terms, and in patriots are not, they are overlapping with nationalists, but it's so complicated. So I don't. That's one thing that just came to mind.
It would be a difference that if you called them right-wingers, for example.
Yeah, but that would include conservatives again. And conservatives and liberals are actually the easiest to model. For some reason, but that, oh my God.
I would like to just add up to, I mean, your game is an example of something that is really fascinating, and it's fascinating not only from the point of view you ask a question about visuals or aesthetics. This case is even more interesting from the point of view of structure, and there are certain, not only gameplay, but in general, certain the level of structure, certain understandings of like the aesthetics of rules, almost what you're doing there. And for a project like that, especially now with such a sensitive topic, immediately that's something that sprung up to my mind. There are two things. Maybe you realize that. First thing is the Buckminster Fuller's simulation of society, in a sense, from the 1961, but the game was analog, designed by him allegedly in the 30s. And the other thing I thought immediately, it is a great, it has a great potential for not only game design research, by far not. Like imagine a research group with anthropologists, social sciences, design as well on top of that, and a lot of other people that would try to model or anticipate. So this anticipatory design is one thing, and yeah, I mean, I think that such a topic with such a structure as well, and those decisions, it just triggers a lot of questions, but it's great.
It's like collective science fiction to an extent.
Totally, yeah, totally.
Fiction,
I mean, future fiction.
It's happening.
Meaning making, maybe.
Any other questions from the audience? Are you satisfied with your question on values? No, because talking about the values of your games, like how did you...
No, I was just thinking that you must take a stance in, like, because science fiction, like, is it science fiction or is it non-fiction?
Well, but you know, like social science fiction was essentially based on like social imagination and trying to tackle contemporary or future problems in a way that is sort of wrapped into a fiction.
All science fiction
all
is
science
social.
fiction is, well, not really, but, well...
Examples.
Examples.
The framing is different, right?
Yeah.
The framing is different.
Non-fiction and fiction. No, I just said that all science fiction is social.
No, but we could...
Why is it called science fiction?
That is a super interesting thing, because the framing is different. Yes, I agree, but actually, since it's a game and you as a player are taking the decisions, then you can play out different social fictions, actually. So it's a framework for playing out different social fiction. You can build a right-wing totalitarian state in that game and play out how would that, like role play, how would you as a right-wing dictator deal with the refugee crisis. And of course, how I as a designer model that affects how I would guess, at least to a certain degree, how I would suggest that a right-wing dictator would deal with that. But then again, it's my left-wing guesswork, so it's maybe not an accurate model.
I mean, as you said, like all science fiction is social. One could say that all models are like personal and non-accurate to an extent, right? So there's no way of avoiding the fact that you filtering players' action through your own model of that idea.
Of course, yeah.
There's no way of even hoping to achieve objectivity. So.
As you know, that's of course the definition of a model, right?
Right. Okay. New question from the audience.
And as you're getting there anyway, Martin, so then the next question is, so how far do your views take you along your, in your game as an ethical compass? And how much is built in with the brief that you're given? So especially in a game like Democracy, how much did you feel like the brief of, where the right, left, conservative, where you sit, how did you feel that affects also your ideas of ethics in general, especially humanitarian ethics?
How it affects me is now your question. Did I get
where you understood where the brief was and where you understood where yourself was? Also in the other games, how do you deal with that when it's not the same? When you've got a brief with a certain set of political ethics and ideas about how it has to be dealt with, and you're on such another side, how do you politically cross that gap?
Well, honestly, I mostly try to distance myself and use research as a tool, especially when it comes to groups like, for example, the religious, that I can anyway not comprehend how their logic, like their whole system of thinking works fundamentally different to mine, so I can only base my decisions on doing research. For example, I learned that traditional Catholic Christians object land value tax. For some, and the argumentation comes straight from the Bible. And it's like, and that's why you don't have it in Catholic countries, but you might have in Protestant countries, which is super interesting when you get down to it. But it's just something you can only read up, because I cannot comprehend their leaps of faith.
Unfortunately, your game has a
anyway.
very big.
But maybe we should talk about orangutans too.
Yeah.
Because
It's the ethics are there everywhere. It's not like it's in the relationship between me and somebody who is imprisoned. Then it's in the bringing expensive technology to a developing country where that technology would have bought, I don't know, the whole family's meals for the whole year, and then asking those same people to help me with the research when they see that I'm taking this technology to the animals who break them in 5 minutes, right? So, and then also in the design, like who am I to design for somebody who is there because of me, like not because of me, but because of us. And then also, how could I ever claim that I would understand that they enjoy this or they enjoy that and so forth. So it's like, it's a constant dilemma of, am I somehow like almost asking for entitlement to do this and also being sorry for having to do that? It's like, yeah, but then still knowing that those individuals, for instance, the 2 that I'm designing for, will be there for at least 30 more years. So I will have 30 more years to figure out this problem. So I acknowledge that they are huge, but I will have time to figure out at least a part of the solution.
We have another question from the audience, if everybody's satisfied with the answer. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for the presentations. This is a question to all of the panel as designers. I'd like to know how do you see the status of the relationship between yourselves as designers and the player of the game, and also the relationship of the game itself with the player, and what are the ethical ramifications of that relationship for you as designers?
again, the orangutans. I would really love to hear an answer to that.
Well, Hannah, you did in fact talk about the ethical relationship between yourself and the game and the player, and that was very interesting. And so I wonder about the.
Well, actually, democracy is sometimes used as an educational tool. So there is, of course, this aspect of making it in a way that it can at least allow the breathing space that learning needs. It's not made as a learning game, but accounting for that breathing space is something that is important. How is it with Aurelio?
So for me, I try very much not to touch this topic outside of the game itself, because as we were discussing yesterday with Paulo's keynote, like the idea of discussing games at this level from a standpoint that is outside of games, for me is like something that I'm really trying to avoid. So I'm like, I feel, so the games I make are like a full representation of my politics and my understanding of the world and what I think is good and bad, but I try not to express it outside of the game because I don't want to take that out of the game. You know, like I would not want to say, oh, this game is about these topics because I wanted to say this specific thing, but I'd rather just like leave it in the game and just notice the effects that they have on players without having like an exposed discourse, exposed conversation on it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I would like to add to that a little, because similar to Anna, I also worked on some animal-related toys or games or digital game toys. And it's fascinating to think about how some of the outcomes of this design process that was also published in other papers, for example, the fact that certain activities de-stress animals, right, can be used in a way that is certainly socially acceptable, such as reducing stress in homebound animals, or can be also used by the breeding industry to make these animals more productive. Right, so I think that whatever you design, the ethical dimension cannot be avoided unless you really focus on an authorial perspective like Pietro is doing. And in that respect, I think that the work of, for example, Peter Paul Verbeek in relation to technological artifacts and how to design and to moralize the design of these artifacts that we can also call games. Yes, it's a crucial thing that we need to add to our design strategies in general, I think.
I would make one very quick general comment. The topic of ethics and or ethical computing kind of seems to be very lively these days, but I would just like to mention that that's also not anything new. And when I reached into the writings of Norbert Wiener and Joseph Weizenbaum in the 50s and the late 60s or 70s, this was the aspect that both of them, the technologists, that they were raising very much. So basically what you can read in their books is when you teach, and this could apply to School of Game Design, but or when you teach your students, or when we design things, whether it's an IT application software, whether it's a more playful digital application, it is not designed in a vacuum, of course. And we should, as designers, or we should understand also why and what for the thing that we are producing is used. In my case, for example, I mean, as you saw, this game is really, it's a poetic, interactive experience. It does not have a lot of the ethical elements in it, but with a game like Democracy 3, for example, that is a different question, right? Or with inventing something like even Facebook, that's another story, it's not a game, but it's a bit of a gamified social experience that also raises you to another level of asking about, asking questions about the ethics of design. And so that's, I guess it also depends on what you're designing, but you're always designing in context. You're never designing in vacuum, so that's a really good question in general. So.
Can I just briefly mention something? Maybe Ida wanted to say the same, I don't know, I'm not sure. But in response to this question about relationships, like building up relationships to the player as designers, I think I can add something to the design or the journey of Can't Touch This, from being a design artifact or designed kind of in the bubble experience towards being discussed and being discursively negotiated by audiences. And one of the first clash that you experienced after the very weird award ceremony was a discourse on embarrassment that we did not really predict. So we had reactions to the game from male players who experienced this Can't Touch This thing, not as a meditative kind of stimulating, peaceful experience, but as the epitome of embarrassment. So that's why they invited us for a paper a paper project that we then used to actually involve in a discourse around this artifact. What is it, and why? How does the embarrassment emerge from people's hearts and thoughts and experiences? That is something that we did not anticipate at all, and I think that is an example for how discourses around games can be very useful to see what it actually is and how it is appropriated by a wider interest.
Yeah, I just want to add something else, actually, that it's a topic I'm very concerned about, and I also kind of, I'm also in the middle of not having too many questions about it. And so one thing about Can't Touch This is that there was no question about we were in the marginalized positions. So the question is not so difficult in this case. And we can really engage in the conversations around marginalization with this case. But but on a more global scale, we are still very privileged being white women, right? So, and also well-educated and part of institutions, so that's, it's real work that I'm engaging with, and for example, this summer I was directing a games program where we did an effort of getting different colors and also we had different genders, a good representation of different genders, and I could really feel how I was, suddenly I was in the powerful position because I was directing this, and I could also see the limits of my own experiences, that it wasn't necessarily, or my own lessons didn't reach actually to that, to strategies they could use. But I mean, I could start a conversation with them, and together we can find somewhere. But yeah, I don't know. It's difficult.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to our first speaker and MC's a comment. One thing that kind of strikes me on the theme that we've been discussing is that I didn't feel like the rest of you, with the exception of him, actually came to your game with any explicit philosophical ideas or agendas to explore. And so it kind of, your descriptions felt to me like the way in which an artist might describe how they came to a particular topic or to write a particular poem or paint a particular painting. The one here that Sesame Street used to have, the which one doesn't belong. The one struck me that didn't belong was the first one. And a key word that he brought up, it strikes me, is reflexivity or self-reflexivity. And all of you have been very self-reflexive about your games, there's no question. But the difference of what he was talking about, if I have this right, was that the game itself is self-reflexive about the medium. And it's struck me that that's what made what he was doing particularly philosophical in a narrower sense that someone in a philosophy department might recognize. Whereas, I mean, anything is potentially philosophical, and I think there's lots of great philosophical stuff in ethics and self-reflection and sexism and all this kind of thing. But what the first speaker was doing something that somebody in a philosophy department would very specifically recognize and say, yes, this is the kind of things we do, rather than just sort of generally philosophical that one might. Does that make sense?
No, I agree with you, and it's also true that I started specifically with a philosophical point of view to be self-reflexive. Right. However, yes, it really depends, as you said in your own presentation, of what is the exception of philosophy that you decide to embrace. I agree, that is my particular angle, but I see that in their own ways, they're all tackling, if you don't want to call them philosophical, at least cultural or artistical ways, expressing themselves through games. And so, in a way, maybe not a full philosophical potential, but it's showing the communicational and cultural potential of video games. So.
Yeah, and I don't want to be advocating any definition of philosophy that necessarily includes some hard version of self-reflexivity, because I think there's a trap there too. I mean, it's that kind of Duchamp trap where, well, every work of art is an absolute definition of what art is. That doesn't help with philosophy either. So, just yeah.
I beg to differ, actually. So. Okay. For numerous reasons, actually. I would agree with you that Stefano's example is very particularly trying to answer a specific question by making or illustrating a question in a game. And that question might have come before the game was designed. Yeah? But if you think about philosophy and philosophical questions, and I will now refer to my game, but I think it's kind of valid in all of them. The question of, in my case, I did a very poetic presentation, but it's the question of randomness, the question of calculability, the question of nature's randomness and or the playfulness of universe is a very philosophical question. That is not to say that I approached my game design with that question in mind. On the other hand, as I tried to kind of show, some revelations or some questions that we approach are more subconscious than we would like to think about them. And that is also, consciousness and subconsciousness is also very, I don't know if I want to stick to terms, it's a philosophical process. And then there's another point I would like to make specifically about making or doing philosophy with games as such. It might be also a bit of a slippery road. It might work, it might not. What I mean by this is the following. Algorithms and digital practices, games, applications, all of this exists. It is made by us, by humans, with a certain perspective in mind. And so my question, like a really general question maybe to all of us, and specifically to Stefano, would also be, there's plenty of digital artifacts to philosophize upon that bring in the philosophy, and the philosophy is within them, so to speak. So, and do you think you can actually, you can in-depth philosophize upon very complex thoughts by means of a very abstract and simplified digital structure? That's an open question, actually, not a positive criticism, so to speak.
Just very briefly, one point before Sebastian. As I was mentioning in response to Jerry's presentation, to me the point is not whether it can be used for philosophy full stop, but how it can be integrated in a larger way of explaining and discussing. So to me, like, it's not necessarily desirable, even possible, to just make a game about something and have that self-standing. But maybe it is, I don't know. As he said, like, maybe there's a way to combining text and experience and audio and video and experience and agency to a point that it can be a self-standing argument. In my opinion, it's like a struggle that is sort of titanic and perhaps futile if you could just solve part of it by having a paper attached to it.
No, it's okay. I was doubting whether... I just wanted to... I think maybe I'm just repeating you, actually, but I don't have a philosophical background, so of course that's my limit here. But as I see it, you come from a different philosophical, it's a different way of doing philosophy, where there's lots of philosophy that are talking about the that we don't that we. That often throwing yourself into things, and the materiality, like you were doing, actually. Yeah, I think that's what, yeah. Sorry, it's a different way of doing philosophy, where we are maybe, actually, at least for us, we started with the materiality, we started with the social situation, and that is informed by philosophy, right? But although I didn't talk about it, that is embodied. Like that philosophy is embodied in our practice.
I think there's also like... I'm sorry, Sebastian. Like some of us come from the design research background. I think it's also important to think about what is the role of the work itself, the game, in relation to the research question or philosophy or whatever. Is it to illustrate a point? Is it to demonstrate something? Is it that the work, when somebody plays the game, they become engaged with philosophical conversations, or they solve a dilemma by themselves when they are doing that? So thinking of, is it like, we have these three modes, like design through, research through design, research for design, and then there is the third one, for. So it's like a by, for, and through. Sometimes people talk about of as well. So it's like the thinking of what is the role of the work that we all have created in this larger project, which might be doing philosophy.
I think that would have been, my question is exactly the other way around. So I had the impression that philosophy plays a role everywhere in all of your approaches, but in each approach in a different spot. So in a different spot, it is more central than. So for instance, in Sonia's game, I had the impression it was actually largely inspired by philosophical thoughts. So it is a sort of a representation or something that comes out as a result of this process. In the Can't Touch This game, I had the impression that it actually provoked a lot of thought when it was there already, when it was in place, so to speak. So it might, and also if you're a game designer, you also follow a certain design philosophy, right? And it's always like you're having actually, it's the old distinction between theory and praxis. You're like constantly building up a theory or putting it in praxis. It is questioning your theory again, and it's all combined. So I think what I feel would be interesting to see is actually where do you locate it in your process. I mean, it's also like, philosophy is like such a big word, right? So. And probably while sitting here and reflecting on things, we're doing philosophy. So that would be interesting to see on which level you actually differ from each other.
Like I said, really quickly, I try to understand the relationship between the human and the animal through different designs and kind of see how they can help us to connect in different ways.
Oh yeah.
So it's a method.
It was, yeah.
Sadly, we have absolutely no more time, but yes, apparently there are boats and food waiting for us, so we should follow Stefan.
Yes. Thank you for this wonderful panel.
Thank you.